The last open sign. The preserves burned at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, and Cecilia Bowen was standing at the stove scraping the bottom of the pot when she heard her son's truck pull into the driveway. She did not look up right away. The sugar had gone past amber into something darker, and the smell of scorched peaches had begun to move through the kitchen, the way bad news moves through a family quietly at first, then impossible to ignore. She had spent the early morning driving out to Pauline Greer's farm for a half bushel of late-season freestones, had come home and peeled them at the table with the small curved knife she kept for this purpose. Alone had stood at the stove for 40 minutes, watching the syrup climb through its stages with the focused attention she gave to any process that required precision. She had done everything correctly. The timing had simply been wrong, which was not the same as failure, but felt enough like it that she stood over the pot longer than necessary, as if looking hard enough at the blackened ring might reveal where the morning had gone off course. The truck door closed with the particular sound of a man who has rehearsed this arrival. Cecilia heard it. She had been listening to the sounds of people arriving at this house for 43 years, and she understood the difference between someone who came without thinking and someone who came having thought of almost nothing else. Her son's boots on the porch steps had a deliberate quality, unhurried in the way of people who have decided not to rush because rushing suggests doubt, and he had not allowed himself doubt since sometime last week. She could hear the absence of doubt in the pace of his footsteps, the even spacing of a man who had decided the thing he was going to do before he got into the truck and had not reconsidered it on the drive over and was not reconsidering it now. She turned off the burner, left the pot where it was. Nolan Bowen was 43 years old and built like his father, across the shoulders, the kind of wide that came from work rather than intention, accumulated through winters of fence posts and cattle gates and the particular labor of a man who had never fully learned to ask for help. He wore a blue button-down shirt that Cecilia recognized. His wife Dina had bought it for him 3 years ago, the kind of shirt you wore when you needed to look like you were taking something seriously. He had worn it to his uncle's funeral in Tulsa. He had worn it the afternoon he sat at this kitchen table and told Cecilia that Roy's diagnosis was worse than the first doctor had said. He had taken his cap off for both of those occasions. He took it off now. The cap was a gray feed company, had creased and faded in the way of something worn so consistently it had become less an object than an extension of the person. He held it in both hands, and he was already pressing the bill between his palms before he reached the kitchen doorway, which was a thing Roy had always done. When the bank called, Roy would come in from outside with the cap in his hands, and he would sit at the same table and press the bill between his palms as if the pressure could reshape something, and Cecilia had watched him do it for 30 years and had understood that the gesture was not about the cap at all. Cecilia turned from the stove. "You want coffee?" she said. "I'm all right." He came to the table. He had brought something with him, a folded document of some kind, and he placed it on the table with the cover side down, which was the way you place something when you needed a few more seconds before the other person could see what it said. The gesture was practiced without being graceful. He had prepared for this morning. He had not prepared quite enough. Cecilia moved to the table and sat across from him. Outside the kitchen window, the pasture stretched brown and dry toward the county road, the grass gone the pale color it went after the first hard frost. Roy's windmill stood at the far edge of the property, still leaning south, the way it had leaned since the spring storm 4 years ago. Nolan had promised to straighten it. He had mentioned it 3 times across 2 years and then stopped mentioning it, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who had moved on to other problems and trusted that the problems he had left behind would continue to wait. The closing is next Friday, Nolan said. Cecilia looked at the table. Closing on what? He looked at the tabletop instead of her. That was how she knew. Not the words which she had not yet fully understood. The direction of his eyes. A person who had done something wrong looked at the floor or the table or the window anywhere. The person in front of them was not, because the face of the person you had wronged was the one thing that turned an action into a fact. The property, he said, all of it. The kitchen clock ticked through several seconds. Cecilia heard the second hand marking each one separately, a sound she normally did not notice because it had been part of the kitchen's texture for so long it had ceased to be audible in the usual way. She heard it now. She turned the document over. Sunridge Manor was printed in cream letters above a photograph of a brick building with 2 wings and a parking lot wide enough for a bus. The sky in the photograph was too blue to be real. 2 white-haired women were laughing on a covered walkway, leaning toward each other over something just outside the frame, their amusement arranged with the particular care of a photographer's direction. One of them held a coffee mug. The other held a book she was clearly not reading. They were performing the experience of contentment for whoever had taken the picture, and the performance was convincing in the way that all performances of contentment were convincing from a sufficient distance. Cecilia placed the brochure back on the table face up this time. On the wall beside the kitchen door, a row of hooks held the organized inventory of a life: the house key, the mailbox key, the truck key, the padlock for the storm cellar, and one more key that hung slightly apart from the others. It was older than the rest, the brass gone, almost entirely dark from handling, the shaft worn smooth where a thumb had moved over it thousands of times, the way a thumb moves over something important without announcing that it is doing so. It was the key to bell feed and hardware, which had been closed for 2 years since the November morning when Cecilia had locked the front door and driven to the hospital and not driven back. She looked at that key now. She dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, though she had not wet them since before Nolan arrived. The motion had nothing to do with her hands and everything to do with needing something deliberate to do, while her mind caught up with what her body already understood. The body understood things faster than the mind did, sometimes by days, and was not always kind about the lag. "When were you planning to tell me?" she asked. "I'm telling you now." "No." She set the towel down. "You're telling me when to be gone." He pressed the cap bill between both palms. The crease deepened. Cecilia understood several things in the moment that followed the way you understood certain things, not by arriving at them through logic, but by finding them fully formed at the center of a very quiet room. She understood that the closing date had been chosen before this conversation. She understood that her name had not been part of the choosing. She understood that the blue shirt was not a sign of respect for her, but a preparation for her grief, which was a different thing entirely and a lesser one. You respected someone by telling them things they needed to know in time to respond. You prepared for grief by wearing the right shirt and holding your cap in both hands and looking at the table while you delivered the information that was already settled. She stood up. She walked to the hook beside the kitchen door. She lifted the dark key, the oldest one, and held it for a moment without looking at it. Roy Bell had been a tall man with a wide laugh and the kind of confidence that other men mistook for competence, and that women who loved him eventually learned was something more complicated. He had opened Bell Feed and Hardware in 1952 with a small business loan and his father's handshake reputation, and he had run it for 30 years as though the entire enterprise rested on the force of his personal presence, which was the story he told at the diner and at the sale barn and at the table here in this kitchen on the evenings when the month had gone well. He had told it with genuine conviction, which was the most important part, because the difference between a lie and a belief that happened to be incomplete was conviction, and Roy had never lacked for conviction. Cecilia had spent those 30 years doing the books, setting the prices, tracking the accounts, managing the suppliers, and learning which farmers needed high magnesium mineral before spring pasture, before they knew they needed it themselves. She had done all of this from a 2-drawer filing cabinet in the back office, and Roy had received the thanks for it with the comfortable ease of a man who had never been asked to examine the space between credit and cause. He was not dishonest. He was not cruel. He simply understood the world through a particular lens, and that lens had been ground and polished over a lifetime into something that showed him certain things very clearly and left other things entirely outside its field of view. She closed her hand around the key. "I have some things to take care of," she said. Nolan had been preparing responses. She could see them in his face, the ready explanations about property taxes and insurance and the structural estimate on the east roof. The numbers he had organized into an argument, which meant he had been thinking of this as an argument rather than a conversation, which meant he had already decided what the outcome would be. She did not let him use any of them. She picked up her purse from the chair beside the door. She put the dark key in her coat pocket. She walked out of the kitchen, and she did not look back to see whether he was watching. The drive into town took 11 minutes. Cecilia drove it without the radio, which was unusual because she generally preferred noise to the particular quality of silence that sat in cars when people were thinking hard about something. Today, the silence was necessary. Today, she needed to hear herself think clearly without anything else competing. She needed to hear what she actually thought, not the softened version, not the version that had been edited over 30 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood into something that caused the minimum amount of disruption to the maximum number of people. What she thought stripped of the editing was this. She had known this was coming. Not the specific Tuesday morning, not the blue shirt, not the Sunridge Manor brochure with its arranged laughing women, but the general shape of it, the slow contraction of the world into a set of decisions made by people who loved her and did not trust her to manage the information they had decided she could not manage. She had felt it in the apartment brochures that had appeared in her mailbox over the past year, sent without announcement with certain units circled in pencil in Nolan's handwriting. She had felt it in the particular way Dina had started asking how she was sleeping, the question behind the question. She had felt it in the small delays, the redirected conversations, the moments when someone had said, "We'll talk about that later," and later had never arrived. She had felt it, and she had not said anything about it, which was its own kind of answer, her own version of looking at the tabletop instead of the person across from it. Cattleman Street ran north-south through the center of town, a 2-lane road lined with the kind of businesses that had survived by serving people who knew exactly what they needed rather than people who were browsing for possibilities. There was Morrow's Hardware, which had occupied the same storefront since before Cecilia's marriage. There was Ruth Ann Pickett's flower shop, its window full of late-season chrysanthemums in copper and rust. There was the pharmacy, the diner, the insurance office where Dina worked 3 days a week, and there was the space between the laundromat and the old rail spur where Belfeed and Hardware sat, or rather where it did not sit because it was not visible from the road at all. That was the thing most people forgot about Belfeed if they had ever known it in the first place. It was not at street level. It never had been. The original owner had built it on the low ground between two old flood control levees on a shelf of land that sat 8 feet below the road's surface, accessible only by a dirt track that dropped steeply away from the street and curved around the face of the first levee before crossing a narrow wooden bridge over the drainage ditch. The building itself was structurally sound, or had been when Roy was alive, but the soil beneath the east foundation had shifted enough over the decades to tilt the whole structure approximately 5 degrees toward the ditch, which meant the left side of the front wall sat visibly higher than the right, which meant the sign across the roof line was not level, which had never bothered Roy, because Roy had never stood at street level and looked down at it the way strangers did. You could only see the tilt from above. From inside, it had simply become the way things were, a particular angle that the body adjusted to, so gradually that adjustment ceased to feel like adjustment at all. Cecilia parked at the curb and looked down. The track fell away from the road at an angle steep enough that a person had to think about their footing, not dramatically, not like a hiking trail, but enough. On the left side of the track, the face of the old levee was rough sandstone and compressed clay, and in several places over the years, pieces had broken away and accumulated at the base in loose rubble that shifted underfoot if you did not choose your steps carefully. On the right side, the drainage ditch ran parallel to the track 6 feet deep and currently holding several inches of standing water and several more inches of the gray-brown mud that accumulated after any significant rain. There was no railing on either side of the track. There never had been. Roy had talked about adding one for years. It was on the same list as the windmill, which was to say, it was on the list that was not a list, but a collection of intentions that had accumulated into a characteristic rather than a plan. At the bottom of the slope, the track leveled briefly before reaching the bridge. The bridge was wooden planks laid across 2 steel beams, wide enough for one vehicle traveling carefully, without margin for error in either direction. The center planks had darkened in a way that spoke of moisture working from beneath rather than above, which was never the better direction. The outer planks appeared solid, their surface paler and drier still, carrying the faint lines of their grain. Cecilia could see the difference from where she stood. She had always been able to see that kind of difference. It was the kind of thing you learned when you paid attention to the specifics of a place over a long period of time, the particular way one part of it held up differently than another. Beyond the bridge, the building, Belfeed and Hardware, in its current state, looked like something that had been managing on its own for 2 years and had developed opinions about the arrangement. The porch leaned, not dramatically but noticeably, the left post having settled into the ground at a slightly different rate than the right, so the roof above the entrance ran at a gentle downhill angle that caught the eye. The window on the right side of the front wall had a diagonal crack in the glass, running from the upper left corner toward the lower center, the kind of crack that had been there long enough to become familiar, which meant it had been there before Roy died, which meant Roy had decided it was not worth addressing, which meant Cecilia had quietly agreed, and now could not remember whether she had agreed because she thought so too, or because agreeing was what she did. The two possibilities were not easily distinguished from the inside. 3 letters had fallen from the sign above the roofline. What remained read BLLFED in faded paint on unpainted wood, the missing letters absorbed somewhere into the weeds at the base of the building, or into someone's garage, or simply into the general entropy of things left unattended. The store's full name, which she had painted herself on the day of the reopening in 1962 after the fire that had destroyed the original signage, had been Bell Feed and Hardware. Not Bells, not Bell Family, just Bell Feed and Hardware, which was the kind of name that described what it was and where it came from without requiring the apostrophe of possession, because the possession was understood. Below the sign in Roy's handwriting on a piece of plywood nailed inside the glass of the front door, closed for now. Ani had written it during his second hospital stay, when he still believed in the word now. He had asked for the plywood and a marker, and had written it himself in the thick block letters he used for official communications, which was his way of saying that this was a temporary state and not a permanent one. The plywood had been there for 2 years. The now had long since become then. Across the street, Ruth Ann Pickett was locking the front door of her flower shop. She had red hair that had gone partly silver in a way she had not bothered to correct, and she moved with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been running a small business alone for 20 years and had stopped waiting for other people to decide what needed doing. She had been Cecilia's friend for 35 years, since the summer they had both served on the county fair's agricultural committee, and had discovered over 4 hours of arguing about the ribbon criteria for the preserved goods competition that they thought in the same fundamental way about most things that mattered. She saw Cecilia's car at the curb, and she raised one hand. Cecilia raised hers back, hoping Ruth Ann would leave it at that. Ruth Ann crossed the street. "You're looking at something very hard," Ruth Ann said, arriving at the passenger side. "Either the ditch or the building at the bottom of it. I'm deciding about which one. Both, maybe." Ruth Ann looked down the slope with the appraising eye of a person who had been growing things for 20 years and understood the relationship between difficult ground and what grew in it. Then she looked at Cecilia with the straightforward appraisal of a woman who had known her for 30 years and did not waste time with indirect approaches. "What happened this morning? My son sold my house." Ruth Ann was quiet for exactly as long as that sentence required. Then she said, "When do you have to be out?" "Friday." Another silence. Then, "You're not going to that place." She said the word place the way you said it when you meant something specific and unpleasant that you had chosen not to name, more precisely the word carrying the weight of all the places it could mean. "No," Cecilia said, "I'm not." She opened the car door and got out. She stood at the edge of the road and looked down the slope one more time, measuring. The outer edges of the track were more stable than the center. The talus on the left required attention, but was manageable if you leaned into the levee face rather than away from it. The bridge would hold her weight on the outer planks. She had walked it hundreds of times. She knew how it felt beneath her feet. She started down. The slope was steeper than it looked, as slopes always were, and the loose material near the levee face shifted once under her left boot in a way that required a quick adjustment and a brief grip on the rough stone, the grit of it against her palm, real and particular and present, in the way that things were present when you needed them to be. The drainage ditch on the right smelled of mud and standing water and the particular mineral coldness that came off clay in October. She kept her eyes on the level ground at the bottom and moved steadily, not rushing, not slow, the pace of a woman who had decided the thing in front of her was manageable and intended to manage it. The bridge planks sounded hollow under her feet in the middle section. She moved to the outer edge without thinking about it, where the wood was paler and drier, and the sound changed to something more solid. The ditch below was narrow enough that falling would be more embarrassing than dangerous, but she did not intend to fall, and she did not. She stood in front of the building. Up close the tilt was more pronounced than it appeared from the road. The front wall ran visibly downhill from left to right, and the gap beneath the door on the left side was wider than the gap on the right, which meant either the door had warped or the sill had shifted, or both, which meant the key might not work the way she remembered, which meant she might be standing here at the bottom of a difficult slope in front of a locked building that would not let her in, which would be a particular kind of defeat she was not prepared for. She put the key in the lock. It resisted. She held still for a moment. Then her left hand moved to the door itself, the flat of her palm, against the wood, and she pushed gently upward while turning the key. Not a remembered motion, older than memory, the body keeping its knowledge in a place the mind did not file things, the place where the knowledge of how to do the necessary thing lived until the necessary thing came around again. Lift and turn. The body knew. The lock turned. The door swung inward. Warm air, stale and compressed, moved out past her. The smell arrived in layers the way familiar smells always did when you had not encountered them in a long time. First, the dust, which was on top of everything, and then beneath it, the old burlap and grain, and beneath that, the mineral sharpness of fertilizer that had been worked into the floor planks for decades until it was no longer a smell on top of the floor, but a smell that was the floor, and underneath all of it, something that might have been nothing more than the memory of the smell of the place itself, the accumulated residue of 30 years of business conducted inside these walls. It was not a pleasant smell by any conventional standard. It was the smell of work done in a specific place over a long time, and it was as specific and irreplaceable as a fingerprint. Cecilia stepped over the threshold and stood inside Belfeed and Hardware for the first time in 2 years. The interior light was poor. The windows were coated in a film of dust that filtered the afternoon sun into something thin and oblique falling in angled bars across the floor. The shelves along both walls were empty except for a few items that had been left because they were not worth taking or not worth throwing away. A galvanized metal scoop, 3 cracked plastic buckets in diminishing sizes, a row of faded seed packets dated from the year before. Roy got sick, the cardboard gone soft, and the printing bleached to near illegibility. Along the right wall, Roy's counter ran the length of the room. It was covered by a canvas drop cloth that had been there since the day after the funeral, when someone had laid it down without being asked, the way people did things in the immediate aftermath of grief, performing small practical acts that they hoped would be accepted as a form of love. The canvas was gray with age and furred with dust. Cecilia crossed to the counter and took hold of the drop cloth. She pulled it back. The sneeze was sudden and total. the kind that required both hands and left her glasses halfway down her nose. She straightened them and looked at the counter. It was scarred in the places where tools had been set down without care, and stained in the places where things had been spilled, and the stain had been wiped but not removed, and along the grain of the wood there were 100 small marks that recorded 30 years of daily use, the way a ledger recorded daily transactions, not beautifully, but completely. Every dent and burn and watermark was an event. She could name most of them. She ran one finger through the dust on the surface, revealing a strip of dark oak beneath. Then she looked at the far end of the counter, underneath the lip, at the place she had always known about without ever acknowledging. The letters were small and carved with a pocket knife, the way a young person carved letters into wood when they were certain the act was permanent and secret, which was itself a kind of faith in the permanence of things. N.B. Nolan Bowen, age 11, in the summer between 5th and 6th grade, when he had spent 3 weeks helping at the store and had considered the counter as much his as anyone's, which was the logic of a child, and also she understood now the logic of a man who had grown up believing that the things his parents built were things that would eventually belong to him. Roy had found it, had made Nolan sand it out. Nolan had sanded everything around it and left the letters themselves untouched, which required a precise kind of deliberate non-compliance that Cecilia had always privately found admirable, though she had never said so. She had stood in the back office and known about the sanding and known about the letters that remained and had said nothing, which was a small thing and also the shape of a larger thing. She looked at those 2 letters for a long moment. N.B. Nolan Bowen, who was 43 years old now, and had that morning placed a brochure face down on her kitchen table and told her when to leave. She moved through the store toward the back. The small room Roy had called the office was worse than the main floor because the office still looked occupied, in the way of a place that had been left rather than cleared. His reading glasses rested on an open seed catalog on the desk, one temple folded and one extended as if he had set them down for a moment and not yet returned. There was something in the specific angle of the unfolded temple, its tilt against the catalog's cover, that looked deliberate rather than absent. The way things left behind always eventually looked deliberate. A styrofoam cup had fused itself to the circular stain it had made on the corner of the desk over the course of whatever morning he had last used it. His gray metal filing trays held papers that were 2 years out of date and still organized with his particular system, which Cecilia had spent 3 decades translating. She stood in the office doorway and looked at the glasses. The last time Roy had worn those glasses, he had been in the hospital arguing with a dietitian about sodium. He had called Cecilia that evening to ask whether she had paid the Greer account, though the Greer account had been settled for 4 months. She had said yes. He had said good girl in the distracted way. He said it when the business was running normally, in his mind when the books were balanced, in the version of things he carried inside him, which was always slightly different from the version Cecilia actually balanced. The version in his mind was the one where Roy had made the decisions, and those decisions had worked out. Cecilia's version was the one where the decisions had been made by a combination of his instinct and her arithmetic, and the arithmetic had done more of the structural work than either of them had ever said aloud. She had been annoyed by it then. The memory arrived now with a gentleness she had not expected, and the gentleness was worse than annoyance would have been, because gentleness meant grief, and grief meant she was still in the part of things where missing him could arrive without warning and hit her somewhere between the chest and the throat in a way that required several slow breaths before it passed. She had thought at some point in the second year after Roy died that she had moved past the ambush quality of it. She had been wrong about that. She picked up the glasses, folded them, put them in her purse. Then she went to the back of the office and opened the door to the small room Roy had called the back room, which she had always called by its actual name, which was the store room, or sometimes, when she was being precise, which she preferred to be the room with the cot. It was narrow, not as narrow as she sometimes remembered it, because memory compressed spaces when it had been long enough, but narrow in fact, the kind of narrow that made you conscious of your elbows. Along the right wall, the iron bed frame stood without a mattress, its crossbars rust-spotted and its legs sitting slightly unevenly on the floor, two of them on the boards, and two of them on the square of old linoleum that had been cut to fit the original mattress dimensions and had curled up at one corner to reveal bare wood underneath. A walnut dresser occupied the wall beneath the window, its surface clear except for a film of dust, and a ring where a water glass had sat for years on the same spot, working its way into the wood with the patient persistence of water. On the wall beside the door, a coat hook shaped like a horse's head, cast iron, which had been there since before Roy bought the building, and would likely be there after whatever came next. There was no mattress. There was no bedding. Dead beetles collected on the windowsill in the particular still arrangement of things that had been there long enough to become part of the room's furniture. The window glass had a small crack in the lower left corner that she had not noticed from the front. Cecilia turned slowly, measuring the space with her eyes. The bed against the right wall, the dresser beneath the window, a hot plate on the dresser if the wiring was adequate, which was a question she did not yet have an answer to. The office held space for a small refrigerator. She could shower at Ruth Ann's until she worked out something more permanent, though asking Ruth Ann would require explaining why, and Ruth Ann would already know why, which meant the conversation would be short and would cost Cecilia exactly 1 moment of not pretending everything was fine, which was a cost she thought she could manage. She stood in the tilted room with her hand flat against the tilted wall and felt the 5-degree lean through her palm. The building had been settling into this angle for decades. The soil beneath the east foundation had compressed unevenly, or the levee drainage had worked at the concrete footings year by year until they no longer held the same purchase against the stone they were poured on. It was not dramatic. It was not dangerous in the immediate sense. It was simply the way this building sat in the world, lower than everything around it and slightly off from level visible to people who came down the slope specifically to see it, and invisible to everyone who drove past at road height without thinking to look down. Cecilia had spent 30 years standing at a filing cabinet in the back office while Roy stood at the counter in the front. She had spent 30 years with her name on the lease and her handwriting in the account books and her judgment in every price she had set and every credit decision she had made and every order she had placed. And when people came into Bell Feed and Hardware and thanked Roy for knowing exactly what they needed, she had stood back and let them, and Roy had accepted it in the comfortable way of a man who had never been asked to examine the space between who received the thanks and who had done the work. She had called that love. She had called it partnership. She had called it the natural arrangement of a marriage between two people with different kinds of skill And for 30 years, she had believed in that arrangement, the way you believed in the foundation beneath the floor you had never opened up to check. The building was below street level, 8 feet below, not visible unless you stopped and looked down from the edge. She had lived the same way, stood in the low ground, done the work, let other people stand at the level of the road. She stood in the room that was no longer a storeroom, but not yet anything else, her hand on the wall that was almost but not quite vertical, and she did not decide anything. She simply stopped pretending she had not already decided. 7 days, she said. Her voice sounded different in the empty room, smaller than she expected, and then after a moment, not smaller at all. She went back through the office and the front room and out the door and down the steps of the leaning porch, and she was halfway across the bridge when she heard her name. Ruth Ann was standing at the top of the slope with both hands in her jacket pockets, watching with the patient quality of someone who had decided to wait without requiring a particular outcome. "Well," Ruth Ann said. "The lock still works," Cecilia said. Ruth Ann looked at the building for a moment. Then she looked at Cecilia, and whatever she found in the look she found was enough. "The wiring is probably a disaster," Ruth Ann said. "Probably. The plumbing sounds terrible. I haven't turned anything on yet." Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. "Roy would say you're being dramatic." "Roy would say that about a lot of things." Cecilia reached the top of the slope and stood beside her. "Roy was wrong about a lot of things. I loved him anyway." Ruth Ann looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has just been given a piece of information they have been waiting a long time to receive. She did not say anything about it. She simply walked back across the street to her flower shop and unlocked the door she had just locked and went inside because there were late-season chrysanthemums that needed fresh water, and doing what needed doing was its own kind of answer. Cecilia drove home. The kitchen still smelled of burnt sugar when she came through the door. The pot was still on the stove. The Sunridge Manor brochure was still on the table where Nolan had left it face up. Now, the two laughing women on the walkway frozen in their arranged happiness, neither of them looking at each other, and both of them performing the act of looking at each other with great conviction. The house was quiet. Nolan had left at some point while she was gone. She could tell by the stillness of the air the particular quality of emptiness that a house had after the last person had left it a while ago. She checked the closet on the second floor first. The extra hats, the winter things, Roy's coats that she had not yet moved. Everything was as she had left it. She moved to the hall closet. The linens, the extra blankets, the sweaters folded on the upper shelf. She counted the boxes. There were 3 cardboard wardrobe boxes in the hallway assembled and taped standing against the wall outside the hall closet. They had not been there when she left. They were the kind with reinforcing bars across the top to keep hanging clothes from wrinkling, which meant someone had brought them specifically for this purpose, which meant someone had come to this house last night and assembled them and left them in the hallway before Cecilia woke up this morning. She stood in front of the boxes for a long time. The assembly had been careful, the tape applied straight and tight at the corners, the bars installed correctly. Whoever had done it well, had done it the way you did something when you wanted the doing of it to demonstrate that you were taking the situation seriously. Dina Bowen worked 3 days a week at an insurance office on the south end of Cattleman Street. She was 38 years old and she had been married to Nolan for 12 years, and she had a quality that Cecilia had always recognized and appreciated, even when it made things more complicated, which was that she paid attention to what was actually true rather than to what people needed to be true. She was also, Cecilia, now understood the person who had assembled these boxes last night, which meant she had been here before the morning's conversation, which meant she had known about the conversation before it happened, which meant Nolan had told her, which meant the question was what exactly Nolan had told her. The answer to that question arrived when Dina pulled into the driveway at 6:15 that evening with more boxes in the back seat of her car. She came in the way she always came in, knocking twice and opening the door, because she had decided years ago that knocking and waiting was a formality that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with a particular kind of distance she did not want to maintain with her husband's mother. She was wearing gray slacks from the office and a dark cardigan, and her hair was twisted up in the way it went when she had been working long enough that neatness had given way to practicality. She had removed her shoes at the mat and set them facing the door toes out the way she always did. She stopped when she saw Cecilia's expression. Cecilia said, "Did he tell you I agreed?" Dina stood in the entry hall and did not answer for 4 seconds. The 4 seconds were their own kind of answer. "He said you had discussed it," Dina said. "He said you were prepared." "When did he say that?" "Last night, when I brought the boxes." She looked at the wardrobe boxes in the hallway. "He said you wanted to move efficiently, that you didn't want a lot of time to think about it." She stopped. "That doesn't sound like you." "No." Dina looked at the boxes and then at Cecilia and then at the floor between them, and Cecilia could see her working through what she now understood, which was that she had assembled 3 cardboard boxes in her mother-in-law's hallway based on a version of events that had been arranged for her benefit, and that the arrangement had been done with care and specificity, which meant it had been done deliberately, which meant the man who had done it had understood that the truth would have produced a different response. "I should have called you first," Dana said. "You didn't know to." "I should have called you anyway." She came fully into the entryway and set her coat on the hook by the door. "I know better than to take someone's word for what somebody else agreed to. I do this for a living." Her voice had the particular flatness of a person who was angry at themselves in the specific way of people who understood their professional competency and were most unforgiving when they failed to apply it in the places that mattered most. "What do you need right now?" Cecilia went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and they sat at the table while the water heated, and Cecilia told her about the morning without editorializing, laying it out in the order it had happened, and letting the order speak for itself. She told her about the brochure and the closing date and the drive into town and the slope and the bridge and the key in the tilted lock. Dina listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to hearing the relevant facts of a situation and separating them from the surrounding noise. She did not express surprise about the closing date. She expressed, if anything, the controlled expression of someone who was not surprised at the event itself, but was surprised at the execution, which suggested she had known that some version of this was coming and had believed it would arrive differently. "How much does he owe?" Cecilia asked. "You'd have to ask him." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." Dina wrapped both hands around her mug. "I know it's enough that I've been awake at 3 in the morning about it. I know it's enough that the sale of this property matters to the math." She looked at the window over the sink at the dark outside it. "I know it's enough that when he gets scared, he gets busy. He calls lenders, moves equipment, makes decisions at a speed that doesn't leave room for questions. We've had a busy couple of years. He should have told me." "Yes, Before there was a closing date. Yes. Did you tell him that Dina met her eyes about 1,000 times? The kettle clicked off. Steam rose from the spout and disappeared into the kitchen air, and for a moment the room was very quiet, and in the quiet, Cecilia could hear the specific quality of the silence of a house that was as of last Friday or last month or whenever Nolan had signed the papers, no longer hers to hear silence in. That particular silence had an end date now. Everything in this house had an end date. She poured 2 fresh cups. Dana took hers without looking up. "I'm not going to Sunridge Manor," Cecilia said. Dana nodded. She had already understood this. "I'm going to fix up the back room at the store." Dina's hands paused around the cup. She looked at Cecilia with the careful expression of someone who has just heard a thing they were not sure whether to take literally. Then, in the way of a person who had spent 12 years in a family that had strong feelings about the difference between dramatic statements and actual plans, she asked the only relevant question: "What needs to happen first?" The question arrived without hesitation, without the performance of alarm, without the preliminary work of explaining to Cecilia why this was difficult. Just what needs to happen first. Cecilia had always known Dina's value to the family, but she understood it more completely in that moment than she had in 12 years of watching her navigate the space between 2 people who communicated in the same language and meant entirely different things. "The wiring," Cecilia said. "I need to know if it's safe. Earl Doss still does electrical work. He does it between 10 and 3 according to Ruth Ann. That's more hours than you might expect from Earl Doss." They finished the tea and packed the hall closet together, Dina calling for keep, donate, or consider while Cecilia made the rulings. They found 6 umbrellas, 2 of them broken. They found a plastic bag of plastic bags and an argument about whether this constituted planning or accumulation. They found a pair of Roy's work gloves at the back of the upper shelf, dried stiff and brown, and Cecilia held them for a moment before placing them in the box she had labeled carefully instead of decide later, which was the same box, but with better naming. At 10 o'clock, Dina left with the broken umbrellas in a garbage bag and a look on her face that was not quite regret and not quite resolve, but somewhere in the territory between them where most of the important things lived. Cecilia sat at the kitchen table with Roy's old address book and her checkbook and a legal pad, and she wrote Earl Doss's name at the top and a column labeled needs and a column labeled costs, and filled in the first column from memory. The needs column was long. She had known the needs since the day she locked the front door 2 years ago. She had simply not allowed herself to think about them as a list. Lists were plans, and plans required a next thing, and the next thing had not been something she was ready to name until this morning, when someone else had decided to name it for her and named it wrong. At 11:45, she drove back out to Cattleman Street. She parked at the curb and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking down the slope at the dark building at the bottom. The streetlights made the scene monochrome, gray and orange, and the building appeared to lean more in this light than it had in the afternoon, the shadow of the roofline falling at an angle that emphasized the tilt. The closed for now sign was barely legible through the dusty glass. She found a marker in her purse and got out of the car. She went down the slope a second time more carefully, in the dark, one hand trailing the levee face for balance, and unlocked the door and went inside, and in the flashlight beam found a piece of flat cardboard from the pile behind the front counter, and she wrote 3 words on it in large black letters. She propped it in the window facing the street. Then she went back to her car and called Earl Doss. Earl answered on the 7th ring. He said if this was about his truck warranty, he had already sold the truck. Cecilia said she had seen him driving it on Sunday. He said there was a pause in which she sounded disappointed. She said she sounded like someone who had just worked a full day at something he had not been invited to, which she was. He cleared his throat and asked where. She said Belle Feed. He went quiet in the way people went quiet when they heard something they had been vaguely expecting for longer than they wanted to admit. I need you to look at the wiring, she said. That building's wiring was old when Roy was running it. A pause. What are you doing over there, Cece? Finding out how much it costs to make something livable. Another pause. Through the phone, she could hear him moving around the particular sounds of a man sitting up in a chair he had been asleep in. 11 tomorrow, he said, and that's me being generous. 10:30. Done. She ended the call before he could revise it upward. She sat in the car for a while after. The town was quiet the way small towns went quiet by 11, not because anything had stopped, but because the sounds had reduced to the ones that were always there. The highway 2 miles east, the wind along the levee, a dog somewhere off Cattleman that had something to say about the darkness and the cold. Down the slope, the sign in the window of Belle Feed faced the street. She had written it large enough to be legible from the road, not large enough to shout, large enough to be read by someone who had stopped and was looking down. 3 words: cleaning, don't ask. A red pickup came down Cattleman Street from the north end of town. It slowed as it passed the spot where Cecilia was parked. In the amber wash of the streetlight, she could see the face of the driver turn toward the slope, toward the dark building at the bottom, toward the sign in the window that had not been there this morning. The truck did not stop. The brake lights came on briefly at the intersection, the red glow bright and then gone as the truck turned east and disappeared. Cecilia watched the space where the taillights had been. Then she looked back at the sign in the window. She could read it from here if she tried. 3 words, and the 3rd word was a permission she was giving herself in public. For the first time, the permission not to explain, which was a different kind of permission than the ones she had been granting herself for the past 30 years, all of which had contained somewhere in the granting an implicit apology for the need. She drove home and packed the kitchen until 1 in the morning. She wrapped Roy's coffee mug in newspaper and set it in the box labeled, "Keep with me." She wrapped the wedding photograph in 3 layers and put it in the same box. She took down the calendar from beside the phone and saw in the square for next Friday a single line in Nolan's handwriting: "Walk through, K Props, 9 a.m. He had written it before this morning. He had been to this kitchen sometime in the past 2 weeks and written next Friday on her calendar in advance of telling her why. She stood in front of the calendar for a while. Then she tore out the page with next Friday square and dropped it into the trash on top of the peach peels and the failed preserves. Outside, the wind moved through the dead pasture grass, and the windmill Roy had never gotten around to straightening still leaned south in the dark, going nowhere in particular, which was where it had been going for 4 years now, and which was, she decided at 1:15 in the morning, with her back aching and her knee complaining and a half-packed kitchen around her long enough. Earl Doss arrived at 10:23, which was 7 minutes late by Cecilia's count and 37 minutes early by his own stated schedule. a fact he pointed out before he had fully climbed the slope. I was carrying a toolbox the size of a small suitcase and a paper bag that had turned translucent at the bottom from whatever was inside it. He was a tall man, or had been, and the years had compressed him slightly through the spine in the way they compress men who had spent their working lives in low spaces, attics, and crawl spaces, and the tight quarters behind electrical panels where you learn to work with your shoulders at angles that a younger body accepted without comment and an older body cataloged as permanent expenses. His white mustache was broad and maintained the kind of mustache that had become as much a part of a man's presentation as his name, and it was the most upright thing about him. "You said 10, Cecilia said from the doorway. "It is 10. He stepped onto the porch without stopping. 10:23. The 23 is part of 10. By that logic, 11 is also part of 10. You starting fights before I've had coffee is how accidents happen." He set the paper bag on the counter. "I brought biscuits." Cecilia looked at the bag. "That a bribe or breakfast? Both depending how bad the wiring is." He walked the store without speaking, which was how Earl Doss worked, she remembered. He had wired half the buildings in this town over 40 years, and he had developed the habit of moving through a space before touching anything, reading the walls and the ceiling and the panel covers with the accumulated comprehension of a man who understood that buildings had their own logic and that the logic needed to be heard before it could be argued with. He moved through the front room, the office, the storeroom. He opened 2 panel covers and made sounds that were not words but communicated clearly. In the back hallway, he took off his cap and looked at the main panel for a long time. "Jean says Roy installed this," Cecilia offered. "Jean is mostly right." Earl pulled a small flashlight from his shirt pocket and directed the beam into the panel. "Roy installed it after I told him not to, and then stood next to him while he did it anyway." "You were there. I was holding the ladder. That counts as assistance. That counts as evidence that I knew better and watched it happen anyway." He moved the beam slowly across the panel, and the sounds he made shifted from generally disapproving to specifically concerned, a distinction she could read from 30 years of listening to men evaluate things they were about to be asked to fix. "How much do you want running?" "Lights throughout, a small refrigerator, a hot plate eventually, or a single burner unit. Something for the back room." She paused. "Heat in the back room. That's the priority." He looked over his shoulder at her. The question was in the look. "I'm making the back room livable," she said. "For now." Earl lowered the flashlight. He did not say no, which meant he was calculating rather than refusing which was the better outcome of the two. He moved through the store, again this time more slowly, stopping at outlet boxes and junction covers, pressing a tester against surfaces and writing numbers on the wall in carpenter's pencil in a shorthand Cecilia could not read. She followed him with Roy's old invoice pad and added her own notations alongside his, translating what she understood and marking what she did not. The estimate took an hour. He wrote the total on the invoice pad and turned it toward her without comment, which was how he delivered numbers he considered regrettable but not catastrophic. Cecilia looked at it. She looked at it long enough to understand it, and then longer, because understanding a number and accepting what the number meant were 2 different operations. The number was possible. That was the terrible part. It was exactly the kind of number that was possible in the way that described not the good end of things, but the manageable end of things. The end that said, yes, this can be done, you will be able to do this, and doing this will cost you something real, which was a different kind of pressure than the pressure of a number that simply could not be reached. The rear circuit's dead, Earl said. Don't plug anything in back there until I replace it. What happens if I do? Best case, nothing happens. He capped the pencil. Worst case, I come to your funeral and spend the whole thing telling people I warned you. That would be more funerals than you manage for Roy. The sentence left her before she had decided to say it. She heard it arrive in the room and watched it land on Earl Doss, the way a thing landed on a person who had been waiting for it and had not known they were waiting until it arrived. I went still, not completely, not the sudden stillness of shock, but the particular stillness of a person who has been struck somewhere they had protected for a long time, and the protection had not held. He was standing at the rear wall with the pencil still in his hand, and he did not turn around immediately, and the silence in the room became the kind of silence that had weight and specific dimensions. I was at the funeral, he said. You stood by your truck. I was there from before it started until it was over. I know. Cecilia set the invoice pad on the shelf. I saw you when I was coming out. You were at your truck. You never came inside. He turned around then, and she saw on his face the thing he had been keeping somewhere. It did not show in the ordinary course of a day, which was the particular guilt that had nothing to do with negligence and everything to do with a decision made over and over again until it became the shape of something irreversible. I called, he said. You called me. You asked how he was. You said you'd come when he was having a better day. He did not answer that. He never had one, Cecilia said, not after the second diagnosis. Earl Doss looked at the carpenter's pencil in his hand. He turned it over once. He was not a man who expressed himself through words when silence could do the work, and Cecilia had known him long enough to understand the silence correctly, which was that it contained more than dismissal and more than discomfort. It contained the specific weight of a thing a person had decided to carry because there was no way to set it down that felt adequate. I didn't know what to say to him, Earl said. You two spent 35 years saying nothing important across a fence line. I doubt he expected poetry. He didn't want me seeing him that way. He paused. He told me once in the good stretch that he didn't want people remembering him in a hospital bed. He said he'd rather they remembered him at the counter. Did he ask you not to come? Earl's mouth tightened in the way of a person whose answer would not serve them well and who was deciding between accuracy and comfort. He chose accuracy. It was what she had always respected about him, even when it made conversations more difficult. Not in those words, he said, but he made it sound like he was doing me a favor by not making me watch. He set the pencil in his shirt pocket. I let him make it sound that way. Cecilia picked up the invoice pad. She looked at the total one more time, and then she looked at the wall where Earl had written his penciled notations, a private language of shorthand and numbers that described the specific failures of this building's electrical infrastructure in terms that would mean nothing to anyone who had not spent 4 decades decoding them. Your labor isn't on here, she said. No, add it. It doesn't need to be. Earl, she looked at him directly. Add it. And held her gaze for 3 seconds. I owe Roy. Roy's dead. She said it the way you said the plain true thing, not harshly, not softly, in the register of something that was simply the case and needed to be treated as such. What you owe him doesn't have a living address. What you owe me is an accurate invoice. The quiet between them changed at that, not softened exactly, but shifted the way the quality of light shifted when something moved in front of a window. Earl Doss looked at the wall for a moment, and then he looked at her, and there was in the look a recognition that had nothing to do with wiring and everything to do with the particular transaction of two people who had known the same man for a long time and had arrived from different directions at the same unfinished accounting. "I'll put in a number," he said. "You can argue about it when I'm done." He went back to work without further conversation, which was the Earl Doss version of agreement. Cecilia spent the rest of that day cleaning. She had bought contractor bags and rubber gloves and a respirator mask from Morrow's Hardware the evening before, and she had bought a mop head and a battery lantern and disinfectant and a large box of mouse traps, and Chet Morrow had looked at the collection of supplies and asked if she was cleaning up a murder or thinking about committing one. She had said it depended on who showed up first. He had laughed and slipped a second box of dust masks into her bag without scanning it, and she had seen him do it and not mentioned it, which was the correct response. She worked in sections. Front room first, because the front room was the part of the store that would be visible to anyone who came in, and she intended people to come in, which was not exactly a decision she had articulated yet, but was becoming one in the way that decisions became themselves by accumulation rather than announcement. She filled 2 contractor bags with trash from the front room alone, then went through the office where the trash bag had been sitting long enough that it had disintegrated around its contents, scattering dried receipts and mouse droppings, and 2 objects she eventually identified as petrified biscuits across the floor in a way that added an hour to the work and a quantity of commentary she kept to herself. She found the wooden display rack behind the counter, the one that had held vegetable seed packets through 3 decades of planting seasons, and she carried it out to the porch and leaned it against the brick wall to check the slats. They were dry but sound. The finish had cracked in places, but the wood underneath was intact. She brought it back inside. She discovered, in the process of cleaning the office, that Roy's reading glasses were not the only thing he had left behind. His personal coffee mug was in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, wrapped in a handkerchief, as if placed there deliberately rather than forgotten. There was a small photograph tucked in the back of the second drawer, a snapshot not framed of the 2 of them at the store's opening barbecue in 1952, Roy younger than Nolan was now and grinning over a rack of scorched ribs, and Cecilia beside him in a yellow blouse with the cash box on the table in front of her, and her face turned slightly toward the camera as if someone had just called her name. She stood with that photograph for a longer time than she had intended. On the back, in Roy's handwriting, "First day back, 4:62 hours." She put it in her coat pocket with the key. At 2 in the afternoon, a shoe scraped on the porch step. Cecilia pulled the mask from her face and looked at the doorway. Nolan stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the expression of a man who had driven past this building 3 times before stopping and was already reconsidering the decision to stop. He looked at the broom in her hand. He looked at the bags of trash she had stacked near the door. He looked at the front room, which was still not clean, but was measurably less damaged than it had been at 10 o'clock, and she could see him taking inventory, the way he took inventory of anything that represented change from a previous condition, the way a man who managed a cattle operation assessed what had happened in a pasture since his last walk through it. "What are you doing?" he said. Cecilia set the broom against the counter. "What does it look like? Like you're cleaning out an abandoned feed store." "Then you have your answer." "I came in without being invited. which was a thing he had done since he was old enough to open doors, and which Cecilia had long ago decided was not rudeness, but a particular kind of familiarity that she had in some complicated way cultivated by making this space feel like his also. She had not always been certain that was wise. She was less certain now. He moved through the front room the way he moved through all spaces, taking its dimensions without appearing to cataloging its conditions and its requirements in a background process that ran beneath whatever conversation was happening. He stopped at the counter. He stood there for a moment, and then he bent slightly without touching anything and looked at the far end of the counter, at the underside of the lip. He did not touch the letters. He straightened and came back to the middle of the room. "This building isn't worth much as it sits," he said. "I know what it's worth. You'd have to put money into it just to get somebody interested." "I'm not trying to get somebody interested." "Then why are you cleaning?" Cecilia looked at him for a moment. He had his father's face arranged in his father's expression, the one Roy made when he was managing something he had already decided could be managed when the outcome was less a question than a formality. She had spent 30 years watching Roy make that expression. She had not spent 30 years learning to dislike it, but she had spent the last 2 years learning to name what she felt about it, which was a different and somewhat overdue education. "I'm finding out whether the back room can be made livable," she said. The expression on Nolan's face did something she had not seen it do before, not change exactly, but pass through several changes quickly, as if the usual machinery that processed new information and produced a response had encountered something it was not calibrated for and needed an extra moment. Then it settled into the flatness that came before he got loud, which she knew as well as she had known its corresponding expression on Roy's face. "No," he said. That didn't sound like a question. "You're not living in a feed store. You're not keeping a feed store. That's different. It usually is when it's your decision." I walked past her into the office. She heard him open the washroom door and go still, which meant he had seen the utility sink, which was encrusted with a mineral residue, the color of old copper, and had a brown stain running from the drain in a shape that described multiple seasons of dripping rather than any single incident. She heard him come back into the office. "There isn't even a shower," he said from behind her. "I've noticed. The wiring is bad. Earl Doss is addressing it. The roof leaks above the loft. It leaked before your father died. We managed. For how long? Long enough that it stopped being a crisis and became a characteristic." She picked up the broom again. "Your father believed that a leak was only a problem when the bucket was full." That's insane. That word is useful when you don't want to discuss the details. Nolan came back into the front room without the cap which he had taken off at some point and was holding in both hands again. He looked both younger and more tired, as if the cap had been doing structural work and its removal had relaxed something that had been held up. He stood in the center of the room and looked at her with the combined frustration and concern of a man who had arrived expecting one conversation and found another, and was not sure how to move from one to the other without losing ground in both. "People are going to see you here," he said. Cecilia swept a line of dust toward the door. Nolan stepped into the path of the line. He had always done that, even as a boy when an argument was developing and he feared she might walk away from it. He put himself in the physical path of whatever direction she was moving, not to stop her, but to make leaving cost something, which was a form of love that had never been comfortable and which she recognized now as one of Roy's habits, transmitted wholesale. "They'll know," he said. "They'll figure out what I did." "What you did is done, Nolan. That's not the point." "Then tell me the point." He looked at the counter. He looked at the space on the wall where a business had operated for 30 years. He looked at the floor where her shadow fell beside the line of dust the broom had pushed. "A man at the sale barn last week asked me if I was charging you rent on the sidewalk," he said. He was serious. "That was rude of him. You think this is funny?" "I think a man asking about sidewalk rent is either very rude or very unimaginative, and I can't tell which from where I'm standing." Something moved across his face that was not anger and not amusement, but somewhere in the passage between them. He looked down at the cap in his hands. "I can help you get an apartment," he said. "A decent one. You can keep the store if you want for whatever reason you want, but you don't have to sleep here." "I know I don't have to." "Then why?" She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light through the dirty windows fell across the floor in bars, and in the bars, dust moved slowly in the disturbed air from the sweeping turning in the light the way dust turned when it had finally been asked to move after years of settling. "Because this building is mine," she said. "Because it was always partly mine, and nobody told that story correctly, and I don't want to live in a room where the story gets told the way it always was." She picked up the trash bag. "You can help by calling Kessler Properties and asking what happens to the barn on the east pasture." I asked, and they don't know yet. "Then ask again." She carried the bag toward the door. "I appreciate the shirt, Nolan. You looked very prepared." He stood in the center of the room and watched her go out to the porch, and she heard him stand there for another minute after she was outside, and she heard the particular quality of the silence that followed, which was the silence of a person who had come to deliver a verdict and had found that the verdict had already been delivered without them. She heard him leave. She swept for another 2 hours without stopping. Harlan Bess arrived on a Thursday, which was not when he had been evicted, because nobody had expected him at all. I was 62 years old and walked with both knees contributing equally to the general impression of a man doing more work than the terrain required, a rolling gait that covered ground without drawing attention to what it cost. He had spent his working years on the Haskell Ranch before it sold, then moved into livestock hauling for various operations in the county, and he had the build of a man who had been loading and unloading heavy things for 4 decades and had learned to work around the joints that no longer participated fully. His straw hat was darkened around the band in the way of something worn through enough summers that the salt had done its permanent work, and he wore it with the same careful adjustment every time, set precisely in the way of a man who placed things precisely. Cecilia had not called him. Nobody had called him. This was something she would only understand later as a pattern rather than a coincidence, which was that people who had been around Roy Bell's enterprise long enough had a certain attunement to when things were happening at it, the way people who had lived near a railroad long enough could feel a train coming through the vibrations in the ground before they could hear it. He appeared on the slope above the building at 10:45 on a Thursday morning at the exact moment the delivery truck from the regional distributor was taking up most of Cattleman Street, and the driver was explaining with the resigned patience of a man whose schedule had already been complicated by this stop that he could not get the pallet any closer to the building than the street level, because his lift gate had a weight limit and the slope was outside the parameters of what he was authorized to attempt. Cecilia stood on the slope between the truck and the building and looked at the pallet wrapped in shrink film, which contained $462 worth of merchandise she had ordered 3 days ago based on 2 requests and an instinct, and which was currently sitting at street level on a dolly waiting for a solution to the 8 feet of elevation between it and the front door. She had called Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann was making a delivery 20 miles south. She had called Earl. Earl's phone rang without answering, which meant he was inside a wall somewhere and had left it in his truck. She had called Chet Morrow, who answered, apologized, and said his back was not equal to it today. She was considering the logistics of moving items individually up and down the slope by hand, which was possible in a technical sense but would take most of the afternoon and would require her to accept the reality of what her knees were telling her about the prospect when Harlan Bess's gray pickup stopped behind the delivery truck. He climbed out slowly. He looked at the truck, at the pallet, at the slope, at Cecilia, standing midway down it. "Where do you want it?" he asked. "Inside would be notable," she said. He lowered his tailgate without further conversation, produced a hand truck and 2 ratchet straps and a scarred plank from the bed of his pickup, and began organizing the operation with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been solving this category of problem for a long time and had stopped finding it interesting. The delivery driver, reassessing the situation, found his way to usefulness. Between the 3 of them, the merchandise came down the slope in sections, the heavier pieces strapped to the hand truck, and walked down the outer edge of the slope where the footing was better. The smaller items carried directly. Chet Morrow appeared at the top of the slope about 40 minutes later when the last of the work was done and announced that he would have come sooner if someone had called. Cecilia pointed out that she had called. He said his phone had been charging. She asked whether it was charging at the bottom of a body of water. He helped carry 2 bags of sunflower seed inside and considered this adequate. Harlan stayed after the delivery truck left. He moved the merchandise to the shelves with the unhurried consistency of someone who did not need direction about where things went, because things went where they made sense, and sense was not hard to read if you were paying attention. He found the wooden display rack she had repaired and carried it to the position beside the counter without being asked, because the marks on the floor showed where it had stood for 30 years. "You need somebody for local delivery," he said. He was standing in the middle of the store, turning his hat in his hands, which she would come to understand was what he did when he was proposing something he was not sure would be accepted. "I've got time in the afternoons. I have 1 customer so far," Cecilia said. "She's across the street. She's got other things she buys besides what's in your store right now." "How do you know that?" "I know Ruth Ann Pickett." He set the hat on his head with the careful adjustment of someone who placed things precisely. "I know what she grows, and I know the highway place only carries 50-pound bags of what she needs, and half of it sets up solid before she can use it." I put his phone number on the back of the delivery receipt and placed it beside the cash box, which was the only flat surface near the counter that was not currently holding merchandise. He did not wait for her response. He went out the back door to retrieve his hand truck from the porch, and the departure was clean in the way of a person who had said what they came to say and did not require confirmation before leaving. Willa Sachs came in on the same afternoon. She was 48 years old with short brown hair and a navy cardigan buttoned correctly at the top and incorrectly at the bottom, and she moved through the front door of Belfield with the specific purpose of someone who needed a thing and had read the address correctly and intended to purchase it and leave. She found the work gloves on the shelf Earl had stocked the previous day using labels from the old price gun he had found in the supply drawer, and she picked up 2 pairs and turned them over and set them back and picked them up again. She looked at Cecilia behind the counter. "How much?" she asked. "I need to check." $6.99 a pair. There's a sticker on the cuff. She said it without inflection, the way a person stated a fact rather than offered an opinion. With tax $14.97. Cecilia looked at the sticker on the cuff. It said $6.99. She looked at the woman. "You calculated that in your head while you were deciding whether to sell them to me." Cecilia opened the receipt book and wrote the sale. The woman produced a 20 and waited for change. Cecilia counted it back, and the woman checked the count by counting it again silently, which was not distrust, but professional habit, the same way Cecilia had always run the numbers twice before committing them to the ledger. "You're going to want a separate line for sales tax," the woman said. "It'll matter for your quarterly. I know how to make a receipt." "I didn't say you didn't." She folded her change and tucked it away. "You're going to want a separate line anyway. And if I do it the way I've been doing it for 30 years, then you'll have the same audit that Belfied had in 2009. She looked at the cash box. "I pulled the public record when I saw the lights on. I do freelance books. I work Mondays and Thursdays." She placed a business card on the counter beside the receipt book. The card had been printed at home and trimmed slightly unevenly. "I need somewhere quiet 2 mornings a week. My apartment neighbor has a television installed at the molecular level of the wall between us." Cecilia looked at the card. "I have an office. I saw it. The peace lily on the windowsill will need replacing, but I can bring one." "There isn't a peace lily." "There will be." The woman picked up her gloves. "Willa Sachs, I know your figures aren't what they could be. People with things already decided only need a bookkeeper half as much." She left. Cecilia stood behind the counter and looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked at the business card. Then she put it in the drawer beneath the cash box, next to Harlan's phone number. 2 pieces of paper in a drawer that had held only a box of paper clips and an old price list for the past 2 years, something that was not yet a community and not quite a plan, but was beginning to occupy the same territory as both. On the Tuesday of the following week, at 5:20 in the afternoon, Dina Bowen came through the front door of Belfied without knocking, which was consistent with her general approach to thresholds, and stood in the center of the front room and looked at the shelves and the cash box and the display rack and the seed packets Cecilia had arranged by type, and she stood there long enough that Cecilia put down the invoice she was reviewing and waited. "I've been meaning to come," Dana said. "I know. Nolan doesn't know I'm here. I know that too." Dina came to the counter. She set down the small bag she had been carrying and took off her coat and folded it over the blue chair that Ruth Ann had brought 3 days earlier, claiming the store needed seating and that a chair from her spare room was the appropriate unit of seating for a feed store reopening. The chair had turned out to be wrong for the space in the way that made it exactly right, a blue upholstered reading chair that had no logical reason to be beside a counter, stocked with work gloves and mineral salt blocks, and which had therefore immediately become the thing everyone who entered the store noticed first and sat in without asking, because it was clearly there to be sat in. Dina did not sit in the chair. She stood at the counter and she looked at Cecilia with the expression of a person who had organized a conversation they had been having with themselves for several weeks and was finally saying it aloud. "I've been doing insurance claims for 11 years, she said. Property liability business continuation. And in 11 years, the thing I've seen more than anything else is this. When someone gets written out of their own claim, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens the same way every time, one form at a time, one assumption at a time, until the person who should be at the center of the record is barely in it." Cecilia looked at her. "Nolan loves you," Dina said. "I know that. I want you to know I know that because what I'm about to say isn't an argument about whether he loves you." She put both hands flat on the counter. "Roy loved you. I know that too. And both of them, in their own ways, made you smaller than you were. Roy did it because he needed to be the story. Nolan does it because being in charge is the only version of caring he knows how to do." She paused. They both called it protection. The front room was very quiet. From the office behind her, Cecilia could hear the small sounds of the building settling in the late afternoon cool, the particular language of an old structure, commenting on the temperature, the building doing what it had always done, which was to record in its wood and its concrete what was happening inside and around it. "Roy took the front of the store," Cecilia said. "I ran everything from the back. Yes. He received the thanks. Yes. I received the invoices and the account disputes and the suppliers who wouldn't return my calls because they wanted to speak to the man. Yes." Dina's voice had not shifted. Its register had not become emphatic or performative. It was the voice of a person stating what the record showed. "And you let that happen. I'm not saying that to blame you. I'm saying it because I think you know it, and I think you've known it for a long time, and I think you've been waiting for someone to say it out loud so you didn't have to say it to yourself." Cecilia looked at the counter. She looked at the strip of dark oak where she had cleaned the dust away on the first afternoon, and at the NB carved beneath the far edge, and at the space behind the counter where she had stood for 3 decades and run the actual machinery of this place in the hours Roy was not here to see. "You're the first person who has said it," she said. "I know. Not Roy, not Nolan. I know." Dina picked up her coat. "I should have said it before I signed the papers. I should have called you and asked instead of believing what I was told." She looked toward the door. "I do that at work. I should have done it for you. You didn't know to. I should have done it anyway." She put her coat on. "Nolan thinks you're doing this to punish him." "I know. Are you?" Cecilia thought about the honest answer, which was the same honest answer she had given Dina the first night, which was that spite was never the whole of anything, but was rarely entirely absent either, and that what was true in this case was something more and something less than pure motivation in either direction. "I'm doing this," she said, "because I want one thing that has my name on it in the right place, not in the back office, on the front door." She looked at Dina. "That might look like punishment from a particular angle. I understand that, but it's not the same thing." Dina nodded. She was not a person who required the last word and did not take it now. She buttoned her coat and picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. "He doesn't know the real numbers yet. He'll tell you what he thinks they are, and they'll be close, but there's a layer underneath that he hasn't looked at. Tell Willa to look at 2021 first." She glanced at the chair. "I like that chair. It has no business being here. Neither does half of what works." She went out the door and up the slope, and Cecilia watched her go from the window. The first Saturday Bell feed opened. They sold $29 worth of merchandise. Cecilia had arrived at 8:30 and turned on every front light which Earl had replaced the previous week, 4 new bulbs under the old enamel shades that came on with the warm yellow quality of something that had been dark long enough to appreciate the light. She set the cash box under the counter. She put Willa's business card and Harlan's phone number in the drawer. She wrote Saturday 9 to 4 on the blank hours page she had left blank for a week and taped it in the window beneath the cleaning "Don't Ask" sign, which she had revised once, adding, "This means you," in smaller letters, after Chet Morrow walked in on the second day of cleaning and announced he could tell she was reopening. She unlocked the door at 9 o'clock. Nothing happened which she had known would happen. There was no crowd. There was no event. There was the sound of the street above, reduced to what it was at that level, 8 feet below, which was the sounds of people who had no reason to come down a slope to a feed store and who would not come unless they had a reason. And reasons were built slowly from the ground up, which was not a metaphor she had chosen, but which fit the building well enough that she let it stand. Earl Doss arrived at 9:17 with a thermos of coffee and a newspaper, the way he had arrived every morning for the past 2 weeks, and he sat in the blue chair and did not buy anything, which Cecilia had come to understand was not the point of his visits. The point of his visits was the thermos and the newspaper and the presence of a person in the blue chair, which had turned out to be a different kind of contribution than she had initially accounted for. At 10, a man named Eldon Marsh came in. He had retired from hay farming, but still wore the overalls and the pliers on his belt that belonged to a working life, which Cecilia recognized as the equipment of a man who had not finished deciding what kind of person he was now that the defining work was over. He walked every aisle and named things that were no longer there: fly spray, horse liniment, a jar of peppermints that Roy had kept beside the register, and Cecilia said she remembered each one and told him none of them were coming back in the immediate term, and he stayed 40 minutes and bought nothing, and at the door told her he'd heard Nolan sold the farm. "Yes," she said. "Shame, yes." He looked at her with the particular quality of a question he had decided not to ask, but wanted acknowledged. "I'm here," she said. "That's the current situation." He left unsatisfied, which was consistent with the nature of gossip, which was that it required a cleaner story than the true one usually offered. At 2:30, a woman named Nancy Greer bought 1 bag of sunflower seed for $5.19 and paid in exact change. At 4, Cecilia turned the sign to closed. The cash box held $5.19, more than it had at 9 o'clock in the morning. The store was exactly as clean as it had been when she unlocked the door. The coffee urn Earl had brought from his garage, which had Belfeed written under it in her handwriting and had been loaned to him for a church supper 7 years before Roy died, sat on the folding table behind the counter with its new cord wrapped around the handle, not yet tested, waiting for tomorrow's opportunity. She counted the money twice. The total did not change. She climbed the narrow stairs to the storage loft above the back room. The loft was low-ceilinged and smelled of old wood and the particular stillness of a space that had not been open in a long time. Empty pallets stood against one wall. Dust lay thick on the boards except where old leaks had left dark circles the size of plates, evidence of the roof's history with precipitation. Through a small window set high in the east wall, she could see the levee above the building, and above the levee the edge of the sky, going orange, with the late afternoon, and below the window at the far end of the loft, an overturned wooden bucket that had been there longer than she had been married. She sat on the bucket. The first sound that came was a cough. She put both hands over her mouth and pressed, not from embarrassment. There was no one to be embarrassed for, but from the habit of a lifetime of managing what she showed in spaces where things could be observed. The second sound was not a cough. She sat on the overturned bucket in the loft of Bell Feed and Hardware and cried with both hands pressed flat over her mouth, and the sounds she made were small and private and nothing like adequate. Not for the house. She had known the house was a house and that houses were not the same as lives, and that a life could continue without the specific four walls it had previously occupied. Not entirely for Roy, though Roy was in everything she touched down there and would be for longer than she could see from where she was sitting, which was long. She cried because the first day of Bell Feed and Hardware in its second life had produced $29 of revenue, which did not cover the electricity it had consumed, which did not cover the cost of the supplies she had purchased, which did not cover 1 hour of Earl's labor, which did not cover the property tax she would owe in February, which did not cover any of the things it needed to cover in order to be what she had said it was going to be, which was a place with her name on it in the right position. She cried because the right position was harder to reach from the low ground than she had understood when she was standing at the top of the slope looking down at it. And she cried most quietly of all because this was the first afternoon of a thing that had her name on it, and her name was on it in a place that had always been empty before, and the presence of her name in that place, even on a day that had not gone the way she needed, was the strangest and the loneliest and the most correct thing she had felt in 2 years. She stayed until the light through the high window went flat, and the temperature in the loft dropped into the range that suggested the heater would need attention tonight. Then she went downstairs and entered Nancy Greer's $5 sale into the ledger in her handwriting in ink, with a line for the tax separated out the way Willa had told her to do it. She wrote the number clearly. She underlined it once. Numbers did not become less true because they were small. She had known that for 30 years. She had just not always been the one whose name was above them. The box arrived before Nolan did. He carried it in at 8:40 on a Wednesday morning, setting it on the counter without announcement, a cardboard file box with the lid sitting crooked because the contents were too high to allow it to close properly. He wore the same work clothes he wore every day, jeans and the canvas jacket that had developed a permanent lean at the right shoulder from the years of leaning out of truck windows, and he had not shaved in 3 days, and he looked like a man who had been driving before he was fully awake in the hope that arrival would settle something that the drive had not. Cecilia was in the office with Willa's quarterly report spread across the desk. She heard him come in through the back, and she heard him set the box on the counter, and she heard him stand there for a moment before he spoke. "I need you to look at something," he said. She came out of the office. She looked at the box. Then she looked at him, and she saw in his face the specific quality of tiredness that was not about sleep, the kind that accumulated from carrying a thing too long in a position that was not designed for carrying. It was the tiredness of sustained effort applied to a problem that had continued to grow despite the effort, which was the most exhausting kind. "Sit down," she said. "I've been sitting." "Then you're rested." He almost smiled. It arrived and departed so quickly she might have imagined it. He pulled out the stool from behind the counter and sat on it, and she pulled the register chair from the office and sat across from him, and between them the box sat with its crooked lid and its overfull contents and its particular quality of something that had been organized and then revised and reorganized until the organization itself became evidence of how much time had been spent with the problem. Willa came out of the office without being asked, bringing a legal pad and the small calculator she kept in her cardigan pocket, and she sat at the folding table at the end of the counter, far enough to be outside the conversation, but close enough to hear it. Nolan looked at her. "She knows the store's numbers," Cecilia said. "If you want an accurate conversation, she stays." He looked at Willa for a moment with the expression of a man doing a rapid assessment and not finding grounds for objection. "Fine," he said. They worked through the box for 4 hours. The papers inside were a mixture of the organized and the discovered loan statements in their original envelopes, alongside receipts pulled from the glove compartment of a truck tax, returns with the relevant lines highlighted in yellow, alongside cattle sale invoices that still had the auction house's carbon paper attached. Nolan had assembled it in a way that told its own story, the way a person told the story they had decided to tell about their own situation, which was usually the true story, plus the parts that were not yet ready to be in the story. Willa had told her to look at 2021 first, and she did, and she found what Dina had told her she would find, which was a layer of operating costs that had been running below the line Nolan had maintained as his explanation of the problem. It was not fraud and it was not concealment in any deliberate sense. It was the accounting of a man who had decided at some point when the numbers started going the wrong way that the numbers he showed people were the numbers he was managing, and that the numbers beneath those were a separate matter that he was managing separately, and that this distinction, while not entirely coherent, was emotionally necessary. By noon they had a number that was different from the one he had come in with, not smaller, more complete. "This is the real total," Willa said, setting the legal pad between them on the counter. She had written the figure at the bottom of a column that showed its component parts clearly, each one labeled and sourced. Nolan looked at it for a long time. "I need 12,500, he said, "to cover the operating note and get through spring." Cecilia looked at the number on the legal pad. "What does the 12,000 fix?" she asked. "It pays the note. The note comes due in February." "Yes." "Then what?" "Then I have breathing room until the spring contracts come in." "Which contracts?" he told her. She listened. She asked about the terms, and he gave her the terms, and she looked at Willa, who was writing numbers on the legal pad margin without being asked, and Willa's face told her what the numbers were saying before Willa said it aloud. "The spring contracts cover the note payment," Willa said. "They don't cover the deficit below the line." Nolan looked at her with the expression of a man who had not been expecting someone at this table to know what was below the line. "I can manage the deficit," he said, "by continuing to manage it the same way you've been managing it," Willa said, in the tone of a person who was not judging the method, but was noting its consistency with the problem, "which is how the deficit got to be the size it is." Nolan's jaw tightened. He turned to Cecilia. "I need the money," he said. "I need it to come from somewhere outside the bank, because the bank is already in the picture, and adding to that picture makes things worse." He looked at the legal pad and then at her. "You have the insurance money. You have what's in the store account. The building itself has equity." He paused. "Dad would have found a way." The room held that sentence for a moment. Roy would have found a way. Roy would have found a way the same way he had always found a way, which was to look at the people around him and identify whose resources were available and apply the assumption that those resources would be made available because love meant availability, and availability meant resources, and the whole equation ran in a direction that ended at other people's money. Cecilia looked at the papers on the counter. She looked at the box. She looked at her son's face, which had his father's bone structure under the tiredness and the 3-day beard, and which was capable of the same expressions his father's face had been capable of, the expression of a man who expected the people who loved him to find solutions to the problems his decisions had created, not because he was selfish in any simple sense, but because he had spent his entire life watching that model operate and had never been given a reason to develop a different one. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Before we talk about the money." He waited. "Your father and I ran this store together for 30 years, she said. Roy stood at the counter. I ran the accounts. Roy knew the customers by name. I knew whether they were current on their balance. Roy ordered merchandise based on what he felt like selling. I reordered based on what was actually moving." She put both hands flat on the counter in the space between them. When people came in and thanked him for knowing what they needed, he accepted that. He was not lying about it. He genuinely believed that what he did and what I did were the same kind of thing with different job titles. Nolan was listening with the attention of someone who was hearing something they had not expected and were not sure yet what to do with. "I was wrong," she said. "He was generous and hardworking, and he loved this business, and he loved the people in it, and he was wrong about how the business ran and who ran it, and I let him be wrong." She looked at the box. "Because it was easier than the conversation, because the conversation would have changed things between us in ways I wasn't ready to change, because I told myself that love was about finding the arrangement that worked, and this arrangement worked, and working was enough." She stopped. Across the store, through the dirty window, she could see the levee above the building and the edge of the sky above the levee. "I spent 30 years making myself smaller than I was," she said. "I stood at the back desk while Roy stood at the front counter, and I called that partnership, and I believed it, and it was not entirely a lie, but it was not entirely the truth either." Nolan had gone very still. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you asked about your father and what he would have found a way to do, and I want you to understand that when I look at how this situation developed, I see the same pattern, not the same story, the same pattern." She met his eyes. "You made decisions about my house and my money and my future without asking me, because Roy made decisions about the store without asking me, and neither of you was unkind about it, and neither of you was malicious about it, and both of you did it because the pattern was already there and it had always worked before." His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not anger, not the pre-loud flatness that she had learned to read over 43 years. Something older and less defended. Something that was there before the defenses had been built. The face of a person encountering, for the first time, the possibility that the story they had been living inside was not the whole story. "I'm not giving you $12,000, she said. "I'm not giving you this building. What I will do is sit here with you and Dina and look at every number until we know what is actually in front of us, and then I will tell you what I honestly think, and you will do what you decide to do with that, and neither of us will pretend the other one made the decision." Nolan looked at the legal pad. "I was quiet for a long time. and in the quiet the building made its sounds, the heater ticking in the back room, the slight creak of the floor near the office door where the boards responded to temperature, the distant sound of Cattleman Street. Above them, the ordinary traffic of a town going about its day, 8 feet above where they were sitting. "I can sell the tractor," he said. "Willa showed me that number. Without the tractor, there's no operation." "I know. You're telling me to quit. I'm telling you what the numbers say. What you do with the numbers is yours." She looked at him steadily. "Your father kept things going past the point they could be kept going because he believed that stopping was a character failure. He passed that belief to you without meaning to. It was one of the things I should have talked to him about and didn't." She paused. "You are better at maintaining equipment than you are at raising cattle. You always have been." Roy treated that as a failing because he didn't understand machinery. I treated it as a fact and didn't say it loud enough. Nolan looked at the wall. "If I sell out," he said, "he wins. Roy is dead." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that was not the absence of words, but the presence of something he had not yet converted into words, had perhaps never converted, because converting it would require looking at it directly. "I used to say I didn't have the patience for livestock," Nolan said, "that I was better at fixing what other men broke." He said it like it was a smaller skill. His voice had gone flatter in the way of someone reading from a document they had not chosen to read aloud. "I spent 20 years trying to prove he was wrong about which one was smaller." Cecilia looked at her son. "You were not wrong to try," she said. "You were not wrong about the skill. You were wrong about what his opinion of it meant." She kept her voice level. "Roy wanted you to need him. That's different from him being right about the value of what you could do. He needed you to need him the same way he needed this store to need him, the same way he needed me to need him. It was how he understood himself." She paused. "I should have told you that a long time ago. I told myself I was protecting the peace. What I was actually doing was letting you carry something you should have been allowed to put down sooner." The room was very quiet. Nolan put both elbows on the counter and pressed the heels of his hands against his forehead. He stayed like that for a moment, and Cecilia looked at the top of his head, at the place above his right ear where gray had started coming in, which she had not noticed before today, and she felt the specific weight of the years that had accumulated between them, not the years of conflict. Those were lighter than people expected, but the years of all the true things she had chosen not to say. Willa closed the legal pad. "I'm going to give you a room," she said to Nolan without looking up, "to talk." She gathered her calculator and her pen and carried them into the office and closed the door, which was not the same as privacy, but was the closest thing the building offered. Nolan came back on the 11th day, which was a Monday, at 8 in the morning before the store opened. I had sold the tractor on the Saturday between. Cecilia knew this because Harlan had mentioned, without apparent intention to inform, that the buyer had needed directions to the Bowen place from the county road, and Cecilia had written the information in the same internal ledger where she kept the things she needed to know but had not been told directly. She had been keeping that ledger for a long time. She had simply not always been aware that she was keeping it. The morning he came back, he set his file box on the counter and sat on the stool, and Willa was already in the office, and they worked for another 3 hours this time, with less resistance on Nolan's side and more precision on Willa's. And what emerged from those 3 hours was a picture that was painful in the specific way that clear pictures were painful, which was that the clarity itself was the cost, and the clarity itself was the gift, and there was no separating the two. The tractor sale covered most of the debt. Selling the remaining cattle at the next auction would clear it completely and leave a modest amount that could manage carefully serve as a foundation rather than a whole. Nolan would need to find work, not immediately, soon. Dina arrived at 5 in the afternoon. She came through the front door without looking at either of them first, which Cecilia understood as the posture of a woman who had decided to be in the room and stay in the room regardless of what she found there. She removed her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and came to the counter, and she looked at the legal pad with its columns, and then she looked at Nolan. "I saw the trailer in the pasture," she said. "Buyer comes Thursday." She looked at the figures. She picked up the legal pad and read it the way she read documents at work, starting from the bottom and working up, identifying the conclusion before examining the path. "This clears it?" she asked Willa. "With the sale and the tractor, yes, if the spring auction holds at current prices." Dina set the legal pad down. She looked at Nolan with an expression that had several things in it, none of which she appeared to be managing. She was not performing containment. She was simply present in the room with everything she felt and was not trying to reduce it to the acceptable portion. "I need you to stop moving ahead of the conversation," she said to him. "Not just with your mother, with me. I need to be in the room when the decision is being made, not after it's been made, and you need me to absorb what's left." Nolan looked at his hands. "I know," he said. "Say it differently." He looked at her. She held his look. The room held them both. "I've been managing it like I could fix it before you had to see it," he said. "Like if I moved fast enough, it would resolve before it became a real thing." He stopped. "It became a real thing." "It became a real thing in 2021, Dina said. "I've known that. I've been watching you run from it." She sat down on the blue chair without acknowledging that she had sat down. "I'm not leaving because of the debt. I'm not leaving because of the tractor." She paused. "I need to know you can stop moving long enough to let me help you. I'm good at this. You know I'm good at this. But I can't help something that's already 3 steps ahead of where I'm standing." Nolan looked at the counter. He rubbed his thumb along the edge where the wood met the metal strip. "I know," he said again. Then differently, "I'm sorry." Willa picked up her cardigan from the back of her office chair and her bag from the floor, and she said she needed to check on something at the hardware store, and she left through the back, which was the Earl Doss approach to being in the right place and the wrong room simultaneously. Cecilia poured 2 cups of coffee from the urn behind the counter and set them down and moved to the office doorway and stood there, not leaving, but stepping back from the center of it. "Your father kept things from me," she said, "not to either of them exactly. To the room. He did it because he was afraid, and because being afraid felt to him like a form of weakness, and he had decided early that weakness in front of me was a different category of danger than weakness in front of the bank, so he gave me pieces." She looked at the window. "Small enough pieces that he thought I couldn't cut myself on them." She looked at Nolan. "I am not asking you to be different than you are. I am asking you to trust that the person across from you is not the audience for your performance. She is the person in the room." Nolan was looking at Dina. The look between them was the kind that was not about the current moment, but about all the moments behind it, and Cecilia recognized it without requiring its content, which was a private matter between 2 people that had nothing to do with her except as its eventual context. She went into the office and closed the door. She sat at Roy's desk and looked at Roy's reading glasses in the top drawer, which she had moved from the shelf because they kept being in the wrong place, which was everywhere, and which she had not yet found the right place for. She took them out and held them, and they were light in a way that old objects were sometimes light reduced by time to a weight that did not correspond to the space they occupied in the memory. She put them back. She picked up her pen and opened the ledger to the current week's page and wrote the date at the top, and she wrote the word forward in the margin for reasons she could not have fully explained, and then she crossed it out because it was not a ledger entry. It was just a word. She left it crossed out and went back to work. The storm arrived on a Thursday in November, without much warning or with all the warning that anyone with access to a radio or a window had been given for 2 days, which meant it arrived with surprise only for people who had decided in advance that storms were always slightly less than predicted and had made their arrangements on that basis. Cecilia had arranged differently. She had called Earl on Tuesday evening and asked him to check the generator, which was Chet Morrow's equipment that Chet had offered, because a flooded basement the previous January had left him with a debt of feeling he had not finished paying. Earl had checked the generator, declared it adequate for limited use, and delivered it to the building's loading area without being asked to deliver it, or for that matter told where the loading area was, which meant he had either remembered or inferred it. By the time the power went out at 7:41 on Thursday morning, the generator was already connected to the front lights, the office outlets, and the coffee urn, with Earl's careful designation of what could and could not be run simultaneously written on a piece of tape affixed to the generator housing in his carpenter's pencil shorthand. Cecilia opened the store at 8. The first customer arrived before 8:15. Leonard Pruitt came in with tire chains clanking from the rear axle of his truck, needing senior horse feed and wanting to know about bedding, and Cecilia sold him what she had and noted what she didn't have on the running list that had been growing since October, the list of things people drove to Mason or the highway store to buy that Belfeed could have sold if it had known to stock them. She added press bedding to the list and sold Leonard 2 bags of shavings she had taken on last week as a partial order from a supplier who had sent too much. C. Leonard did not ask about credit. He paid cash from a wallet he kept in the front pocket of his overalls, old style, flat and worn. He stacked the bags against the passenger seat of his truck, declined help carrying them, and came back to the doorway. Roy used to give me 30 days, he said. I know, always settled by the 15th. I know that too. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat, which was ice-coated along the top edge. Just so you know, I know the difference between credit and charity. I didn't say you didn't. He left, and she wrote Leonard Pruitt in the ledger and marked it paid and kept the first entry on the credit page blank. The next 3 hours were the busiest Belfeed had seen since its reopening. People came down the slope with the careful negotiation of adults who had decided a thing was worth the risk and were managing the risk one step at a time. Harlan arrived at 9:15 and backed his truck to the loading area and began making deliveries to addresses he had already identified without being asked to identify them, a list of 4 that he had apparently compiled from conversations she had not been present, for which was consistent with his general approach to necessary information, which was that it existed and could be located if you paid attention to where people were when they said things. Earl stayed at the store and helped with the heavy items lifting, with his legs in the concentrated way of a man who knew exactly how much he was allowed to lift and stayed precisely at that limit through an act of will rather than weakness. Willa arrived in the middle of the morning with her laptop under her arm and no apparent concern about the storm, set up the credit slips on the counter with her own pen and her own organizational system, and began processing sales and recording names and amounts with the same focused efficiency she brought to the Tuesday and Thursday bookkeeping sessions. Ruth Ann came at 10 with ham biscuits made on her gas stove at home, which meant she had made them before coming, which meant she had decided to come before the store opened, which Cecilia noted and appreciated without saying. Chet Morrow came at 11 with a folding table from the hardware store and acclaimed that he needed somewhere to sit, which was true in the way that the least interesting version of a thing was always technically true. The store became full in a way it had not been full before, not crowded exactly, but occupied in every part, people moving through the aisles and standing at the counter and sitting on the folding chairs Chet had arranged along the back wall and on the blue chair that had become over the preceding weeks essentially a public fixture. The coffee urn ran twice. Willa made a third pot. The sound of the store was different from the sound it made when it was quiet, layered in the way of a space that had been designed for this specific kind of use, which was the use of people in a community who needed things and who had come to a single place where those things could be found. Cecilia worked the counter and answered questions and located items and wrote up sales, and in the spaces between, she stood for a moment and listened to the sound the store was making, which was a sound she had heard 1,000 times in this building and which had been absent for 2 years and which was now present again, and the return of it was not simple. It was not only Roy she heard in it, she heard herself. The afternoon went dark early, the sky dropping to the flat gray-white that preceded hard snow. By 2, the pace had slowed, and by 3, it had nearly stopped the street above, empty of the occasional tire sound that had punctuated the morning. Harlan came back from his last delivery and reported that the county road south was passable, but the crossroads at the highway were glazed enough to make him slow to a walking speed, which meant they were impassable by normal people's standards. At 4:40 in the afternoon, Nolan came in. I came down the slope with his arms out for balance, the way anyone came down the slope when it was covered in ice, which was not graceful but was effective, and he wore his work coat and a 3-day beard, and he had ice along both shoulders and across the top of his hat, which meant he had been outside long enough for it to accumulate. He came through the front door and stopped and looked at the store, the people at the folding chairs, the depleted shelves, Willa at the credit station, Earl beside the generator cord, Harlan in the back doorway drinking coffee, Ruth Ann folding the paper ham biscuit bags for the trash. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Cecilia behind the counter. I need 4 bags of range cube, he said, and a stock tank heater if you have one. I have a tank heater without the tank, and I have 3 bags of range cube. He looked at her. I have 26 head, he said. I know your operation. 3 bags gets me through 2 days. 3 bags gets Leonard Pruitt through 4 days, and he called this morning. She held his look. I have 3 bags for you. 7 days. Nolan stood at the counter. He was not arranging his face. Whatever was on it was the unrehearsed version. She could see in it the layered response to what she had said, the reflex of the son who had always received accommodation in this space, and the understanding that came after the reflex, which was that the accommodation being offered now was the same accommodation extended to every person in the county, not more and not less, not a comment on their relationship, but an expression of something she was doing that had nothing to do with proving a point and everything to do with how the store operated now. He looked at the ledger. He saw Leonard's name at the top of the credit page. He saw Dale Ferris below it, the name of a man he recognized from the sale barn, 2 bags, 7 days. He saw a third name he did not know, the handwriting slightly uneven, 1 bag signed with the careful effort of someone unused to the form. He picked up the pen she had set on the counter. He wrote Nolan Bowen in the space for the name, and he wrote 3 bags range, cube tank heater in the space for the items, and he wrote the date in the space for the date, and he did not say anything while he was writing or after he had written it. Earl and Chet carried the 3 bags to the loading area, and Harlan loaded the tank heater. Nolan paid for nothing because the credit page recorded what was owed, and 7 days was what he had, the same as everyone else on the page, and Cecilia did not adjust the terms because he was her son. At the door, with 1 boot already on the porch, he turned. Leonard Pruitt lives at the Becker Road address, he said. East side past the dip at the bridge. That bridge will ice at the center first, and Harlan's truck has a wider axle than mine. He paused. I'm going past there in the morning to check my pasture fence. I can take Leonard's feed. Delivery is $5 plus mileage, Cecilia said. His jaw moved. Fine. And Harlan will need a signed slip from Leonard confirming receipt. He looked at her for a moment. I know how delivery works. Then you know how to fill out the form. I went out the door and down the porch steps and across the bridge and up the slope, and at the top of the slope he stopped and turned, not toward the sign, toward her. He stood there for a moment in the flat gray light, with the ice coming down and his shoulders carrying the ice and his hands in his pockets, and she was standing in the lit doorway of the store below the road level, and they looked at each other across the slope and the bridge and the 8 feet of elevation that had always been between them. He turned and walked to his truck. Cecilia went back inside. She stood behind the counter and picked up the ledger and looked at his handwriting. Nolan Bowen, not the initials under the counter lip, his full name on a credit page in a store that was hers. He came back the next day with Leonard Pruitt's signed receipt and $5 in cash. Cecilia took the cash and set it in the drawer and stamped the credit slip paid and handed him the copy. He folded it into his jacket pocket without looking at it. Roads were passable by 8, he said. I heard. Leonard said to tell you the feed worked. Same formulation as Roy used. It is. He looked at the counter. He looked at the empty space behind it, where Roy had stood for 30 years and where she now stood. He looked at the doorway to the office and at the peace lily Willa had placed on the windowsill, which was Willa's 3rd peace lily, the first 2 having succumbed to conditions that Willa described as the store's hostile attitude toward plant life, and which Cecilia suspected were related to the building's temperature fluctuations in the early weeks before the insulation in the back room was addressed. I sold the rest of the cattle, he said. I know. How? Harlan. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Applied for the county maintenance position, road equipment and generator work. He said it the way you said a thing you had decided to say and were not asking for a response to. Interview is Friday. Cecilia looked at him. You'd be good at it, she said. I know. He said it without defense, which was different from the way he had always said things he knew about himself, the slightly louder quality that covered uncertainty. He said it simply the way you said a thing that had always been true and which you had finally stopped needing to argue with. She went to the office and came back with a small box, the one from the kitchen carton she had found under the second-to-last kitchen shelf during the final packing of the farmhouse. She set it on the counter. He looked at it. "I found this when I was packing," she said. "I meant to give it to you at the time." He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old dish towel, was the framed photograph from the opening barbecue in 1952. Roy at the grill, younger than Nolan was now. Cecilia in the yellow blouse with the cash box. First day back, $417.62. Nolan looked at the photograph for a long time. "He's younger than me in this," he said. He was 31. He looked sure of himself. He always looked sure of himself. She paused. He was less sure of himself than he looked. "That's something I should have told you sooner." He used to come into the back office after difficult customers and sit in the chair by the filing cabinet and say nothing for 5 minutes, and then he'd stand up and go back out. She looked at the photograph. He let you think the performance was the actual thing. That wasn't fair to either of you. Nolan set the photograph on the counter and looked at it. "I kept thinking, if I could just hold it together long enough," he said. "If I could just get to the spring, and then to the fall, and then to the next spring. I kept thinking I was that close to the turn. I know. It was never going to turn. I know that too." She looked at him. "So did you." I did not argue with it. He stood at the counter in the store below the road, and he looked at the photograph of his father at 31, and then he looked at his own hands on the counter, and there was in his face something she had not seen clearly before, the thing underneath the Roy resemblance, which was not Roy at all but Nolan himself, her son, who had spent a long time trying to be legible through the template of a man who was gone. "I'm sorry I sold the house the way I did," he said. "Not the way I did it, the way I did." Cecilia looked at him. "I know you are," she said. "That's all. It's enough to start." She picked up a receipt book. "There's a hot plate in the office, if you want something to eat before you drive." I went into the office and found the pot she had left on the hot plate and poured himself coffee and stood in the office doorway while she worked through the morning's first receipts, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the kind of silence that meant something different than the silences that had preceded it. Not agreement, not resolution, something that was simply the two of them in the same room without the performance of either position. He fixed the rear door hinge on his way out. He did it without asking and without announcing, crouching at the door with a screwdriver from his jacket pocket, and when he stood up, the door swung clean and level without the drag it had had since she moved in. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "The bracket on the left was stripped," he said. "Used a longer screw." "Thank you." He left. She stood at the door for a moment after it closed, testing the swing. It moved without resistance in either direction, which was not how doors were supposed to close, but was how this one had always moved, and having it move correctly was a small adjustment that changed the quality of entering and leaving in a way that was out of proportion to the size of the repair. She went back to the ledger. Willa produced the rent check on the first Monday of December. She had been occupying the office Mondays and Thursdays for 2 months by that point, with her peace lily on the windowsill and her printer on the corner of Roy's desk and her cardigan on the hook beside the door that she had never asked permission to use. "I'm your tenant," she said, sliding the check across the counter. "Formally." Cecilia looked at it. "You've been my tenant informally since October." Informally is how things become resentment. We talked about this. You talked about it. I listened. That's how you learn. Willa looked at the peace lily. It's doing better. You moved it closer to the window. It needed to be where it could be seen. She said it the way she said most things, which was as if it were only about what it was literally about. Cecilia had been learning to read the other layer in the 3 months she had known Willa Sachs, which was the layer that was about something in addition to the literal thing. She put the check in the drawer. In February, Dina came into Belfeed on a Tuesday morning and sat at the folding table with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of composed expression that meant she had organized the conversation in advance but was trying not to make that obvious. We're trying 4 nights a week now, she said. That's more than 3. We're moving through the experiment. She held her cup. He still moves fast. It's probably not going to change all the way. She paused. But he stops. When I ask him to stop, he stops. That's new. She looked at the window. He applied for the county job. I heard. Did you hear he got it? Cecilia looked at her. Dana smiled, and it was the real version of her smile, the one that did not manage itself. He called me from the parking lot after. He sounded like himself. Which self? Dina thought about it. The one that doesn't need to be the story, she said, the one that just does the work. Cecilia set down her cup. She thought of Roy at 31 in the yellow-backed photograph, grinning over scorched ribs, and she thought of Nolan at 43 fixing a door hinge with a screw from his jacket pocket, and she understood that the distance between those 2 images was not the distance between failure and success, but the distance between a performance and a practice, which was the distance most people spent their lives trying to close. He's going to be all right, Cecilia said. It was not a question. Yes, Dina said. Eventually, he's going to be exactly all right. The sign arrived on a Tuesday in March. Cecilia had ordered it from a sign maker in town, giving the specifications she had decided on over several weeks of revisions that she had kept in a notebook and not shared with anyone, not because she was keeping them secret, but because the decision felt like something that needed to be made alone before it was made in public. She had written and crossed out and rewritten and reconsidered, and what she had finally decided on was simple, which was usually where she arrived when she had been thinking about something long enough. The sign was cream-colored with dark letters, Bell Family Feed and Hardware, EST 1952. The letters were clean and dark and legible from the road, which she had confirmed by standing at the top of the slope while the sign maker stood at the bottom with a mock-up. Roy's name was not on it. Her name was not on it. The family name carried everything she intended it to carry. The man she had built this with the son who was learning a different version of what building meant. The 2 years the door had been locked and the months since she had unlocked it. It carried the 30 years of mornings behind the filing cabinet and the receipts she had written and the accounts she had maintained and the prices she had set. And it carried the months since she had written, owned and operated by Cecilia Bowen, on a card she had placed under the glass of the counter where anyone could read it. The installation required a ladder and a drill and 2 people, which turned out to mean Earl on the ladder and Nolan on the ground beneath him, since Nolan had arrived at 8 in the morning with his truck and his tools and the particular early energy of a man who had started a new job the previous week and was discovering what it felt like to be good at something without needing it to be the most important thing. They disagreed about the bracket placement. This was not surprising. Earl and Nolan had disagreed about the porch repair, the loft stairs, the drainage from the back door, and the correct way to carry a piece of glass without breaking it. They disagreed with the focus intensity of 2 people who each believed They were correct, and neither of whom was entirely wrong. Ruth Ann stood on the slope above and watched the disagreement with the focused appreciation of someone who had seen both of these people be wrong before and was reserving judgment. Chet Morrow came out of the hardware store across the street and contributed an opinion nobody had solicited. Willa stood at the front door of Belfeed with her peace lily under one arm, holding it outside so it could witness what she called a significant event, and which Cecilia had told her was a piece of painted wood being attached to a building. Harlan Best sat on the porch steps and watched the proceedings with the stillness of a man who had seen enough difficult things get accomplished to understand that adding commentary was not the same as adding value. Earl made the final call on the bracket placement, descended the ladder, and declared the installation complete. Nolan walked back across the bridge and up the slope and stood on the road above the building and looked down. Then he looked at Cecilia, who had come up the slope beside him and was standing at the curb looking down with him. "Tilts a little," he said. "Which way? Toward the ditch. That's the building." He looked at it for another moment. "It's been like that the whole time, since before Roy bought it." He was quiet, looking at the sign on the tilted building in the low ground between the levees. The letters caught the March light, the way new paint caught light slightly too bright for its surroundings, the newness declaring itself against the aged brick and the weathered wood around it. "It looks like something," he said. "It is something. I mean, it looks real." She looked at it, the sign, the building, the slope, the bridge with its newer center planks that Earl had replaced in January, after she mentioned the old ones twice, without fanfare and without invoice, which she had eventually settled by adding the cost to Earl's labor account and not telling him she had done it. The ditch running along the right side of the track, still 6 feet deep, still mud-colored, still not a place you wanted to fall. The levee above the building keeping the high water from the low ground, doing the invisible work that kept the structure possible. "It's been real," she said. "It was real when it didn't have a sign." Nolan looked at the card visible through the front window, the one she had placed under the counter glass on the day she first opened. Owned and operated by Cecilia Bowen. He had seen it a dozen times. He looked at it now in the way of a man who was reading it differently than he had read it before, reading not the words but what was underneath them, the history that the words described without being able to fully contain. "I shouldn't have told you when you had to leave," he said. "No, I should have told you what was happening before there was a date. Yes, if I'd done that, you might have—" He stopped. "Might have what?" He looked at the sign. "Might have ended up in the same place, just with more notice." She considered this. It was honest, and honesty from Nolan came in the same unpolished register that it had come from Roy, the version that was true but had not been refined into comfort. She appreciated it in the same way she had appreciated its predecessor. "You're probably right," she said. "With more notice, I would have known the last morning was the last morning before a stranger told me to move my car." She paused. "That's the part that mattered, not the decision, the knowing." He nodded. They stood at the edge of the road above the building for another minute. Below them, Earl came out of the front door and looked up and gave a brief nod that conveyed the assessment of a man who had done his part adequately and was ready to discuss coffee. Willa returned the peace lily to the office. Harlan collected his tools from the porch. Ruth Ann crossed back over to her flower shop, pausing at the door to take one more look at the sign, which she then apparently decided was worth the trip. Chet Morrow was already gone. He had left when the bracket argument ended. which was consistent with his general approach to effort. Nolan reached into his jacket pocket and produced a key. Not his, she saw when she looked at it. His was on a separate ring and was newer. This one was a copy, the cuts freshly made, the metal still bright at the edges without the dark that came from years of handling. He held it out. "I made a copy," he said. "I didn't want you to change the locks without knowing." She looked at it in his palm. It was the same size as her key, which was the same size as the key she had taken from the hook in the farmhouse kitchen on the morning he had told her when to leave. The same weight, a different history. "The lock doesn't fully catch," she said. "You have to push up on the door while you turn it." "I know. Do you?" He held her look. "Lift and turn. Roy showed me." "Roy showed you." "When I was 11, the summer I worked here." He looked at the key in his palm. "He said the building settles, but the door remembers how to open." She took the key. She held it for a moment and felt its weight, which was the same as every other key she had held, and which was not the same at all. And then she put it in her coat pocket beside the photograph and the old key and the inventory of a life that had been rearranging itself since October into something she could not have named in advance but could now recognize by feel. "Come on Thursday," she said. "The roof over the loft needs looking at before the spring rain. Wiring or structural, both probably. Earl'll want to be involved." "Earl's always involved. He just prefers it if you don't say so out loud." Nolan came down the slope with her, and they walked across the bridge, which held them both without comment, and he held the front door because the angle made it swing close faster than intended, and she went in first, and the bell above the door made its small sound, and the store received them the way it had learned to receive people, which was with the plain, unsentimental readiness of a place that had been doing this for a long time and had developed its own opinions about the arrangement. She went behind the counter. He stood on the other side of it. "I'll see you Thursday," he said. Yes. He went out the front door, and she heard the bridge, and she heard his truck on the slope, and she heard him reach the road above. She heard the truck engine, and then she heard it change, and then she heard it go. She stood behind the counter. In Bell Feed and Hardware, owned and operated by Cecilia Bowen, on a March morning with the new sign outside and the old key in her pocket, and the peace lily on the windowsill, and the credit ledger open to the current page, she picked up her pen. She drew a line under the last entry and wrote the date at the top of the next page. The store was 8 feet below the road. The building leaned 5 degrees toward the ditch. The sign outside was new, and the sign inside was older than the sign, and the work was as old as she was and older, and all of it was hers in the right position, in a place where anyone who stopped at the edge of the road and looked down could read it clearly. She began,